19 years. That is how long I had worked for the Interstellar Transit Authority before anyone from outside the division asked me to account for them. 19 years of fuel load certifications, equipment inspection manifests, transit corridor routing amendments, and docking protocol compliance filings. 19 years of paperwork that nobody celebrated and nobody read unless something went wrong, at which point they read it very closely and were usually relieved to find it was in order. I am not a remarkable person. I am aware of this. I am a compact woman of 51 with reading glasses that have lived in my breast pocket since I was 43, and a preference for sensible shoes that I am not embarrassed about. My name is Priya Suresh. My rank is Warrant Officer, First Class, Transit Authority Logistics Division, Station Orvith 2. My file contains no commendations for valor, no medals, no citations for distinguished conduct. It contains 19 years of work done correctly, on time, with the forms filled out in full. I grew up in Chennai, in a house with a back garden that connected to 4 other back gardens through a gap in the hedge that nobody bothered to close. And the neighborhood dogs knew this and used it accordingly. By the time I was 8, I had learned to read a dog's body language the way you learn anything essential, not from a book, but from paying attention to what happened when you got it wrong. Our dog was a brown mixed breed named Copper, who weighed about 40 pounds and had strong opinions about strangers and no opinion at all about weather. He lived to 15 and died with his head in my mother's lap, and when I left for university, I cried for him for 3 days and only a little bit about anything else. I did not have a dog through my 20s. I was moving too much. The Transit Authority assigns junior compliance officers to rotating station postings in the first 8 years of service. And I rotated Davin Station, then Corinth 7, then the Perth Hub, then back to Davin. I learned the work in those years. I learned the deep logic of it, which is not complicated, but which a lot of people never bother to understand, which is simply that procedure exists because humans die when it isn't followed, and the procedure was usually written by someone who knew specifically how. You read a fuel load certification protocol, and it looks like bureaucracy. You find out it was written in the aftermath of a specific incident, and suddenly it looks like what it is, which is a document written by people trying to make sure that specific thing never happens again. I became the kind of person who reads the revision history. When I got the permanent posting at Orvith 2, I was 32. I went back to Earth on my first long leave and came back with Kestrel. She was 8 weeks old, a black Labrador retriever from a breeder in New South Wales who had been producing working line dogs for 30 years and who tested the puppies at 7 weeks for temperament, drive, and nerve. Kestrel had tested at the very top of the litter in nerve, specifically, the breeder said, in what she called confident calm. She wasn't the boldest puppy. She wasn't the most energetic. She was the one who, when you put something unfamiliar in front of her, approached it, investigated it, sat down, and waited to find out what it was going to do. The breeder said she had one puppy like this in every 3 or 4 litters. She called them the anchor pups. I brought her back to Orvith 2 in a carrier that she fit inside with about 4 inches to spare, and she sat in it the entire transit without making a sound, watching the world go by through the carrier's mesh door with the calm, data-gathering attention that I would come to know very well. She has been with me since. She has lived at Orvith 2 for 5 years, which means she knows the station the way I know the station, which is thoroughly. She knows which corridors get the most traffic at what hours. She knows the smell of everyone in the logistics division and several people in the divisions adjacent to mine. She knows the sound of each of the 8 transit runners. Not just the general sound of a runner, but each specific one. The small variations in engine acoustics that come from years of maintenance records and individual mechanical histories. I know this because she responds differently to each one. Runner 3 she ignores completely when it comes in, because Runner 3's approach profile is the most consistent. Runner 6 she perks up for because Runner 6 had the pressure seal issue and she noticed the change in acoustics before I had the equipment flag on my desk. I cannot prove this, but I believe it. She has a green Transit Authority identification tag on her collar because all working animals aboard Orvith 2 are required to be registered under Station Administrative Code 7, and I registered her the week she arrived. The tag says Kestrel, Ta Logistics Div Handler, WO Suresh, non-operational. The non-operational designation is accurate in the sense that she does not have a formal function. She comes to the office with me. She lies under my desk. When someone sits across from me and begins to say something that is going to be complicated, she puts her head in my lap without being asked, and I scratch her ears while I think, which helps me think. This has been our arrangement for 5 years. The division has, over those 5 years, adapted to her presence the way people adapt to anything that makes sense after a while. Junior Compliance Officer Ravina Okonkwo brings her a treat on Mondays, which Kestrel accepts without enthusiasm and eats without drama. Maintenance Technician Yusuf Halabi, who is allergic to dogs but manages it with medication, he started taking 2 weeks after Kestrel arrived without telling anyone why, leaves his office door open so she can check on him when she does her rounds, which she does every morning at around 8:30, moving through the division at a steady walk, pausing in each doorway long enough to confirm that everything is as it should be, and then continuing. Nobody asked her to do this. She simply does it. After her rounds, she comes back to my office and lies down and stays there until the mood of the division requires something else from her, which she determines by methods I have stopped trying to fully understand. When we lose someone, when a personnel transfer comes through and a familiar face doesn't come in anymore, she notices. She checks the empty desk for 2 or 3 days with the focused attention of a dog looking for something she knows should be there. And then she stops and she doesn't go back. She does not appear to grieve in any way I can identify. She simply updates her map of the world and continues. I find this clarifying. When we hired Navigator Chen, who was new to station assignments and arrived nervous, Kestrel spent the first 3 days of Chen's posting sleeping in the doorway of her office. Not inside, just in the doorway where she was visible. After 3 days, she went back to her spot under my desk. Chen told me later that she had spent those 3 days feeling obscurely safer than she had any reason to feel, and that she had not understood why until she noticed that Kestrel had moved on when she stopped needing her. These things are not in any documentation. They are not in the administrative record of the Logistics Division of Station Orvith 2. They are not things I reported or filed or noted. They are simply part of what the last 5 years have been, and I am telling you about them now because they are relevant to how Kestrel came to be lying under my chair in the Kavith Review Board session room on the morning of the 14th of March, and why, when Delegate Huron Voss asked me to remove her, I did not. That is my credential. That is the only one I brought to the Kavith Review Board on the morning of the 14th of March. I also brought Kestrel. The Kavith Credential Review Board convenes on rotating stations throughout the sector every 18 months to audit operational licenses held by non-Kavith transit and logistics entities. They are within their rights to do this. The Kavith are a large and procedurally serious species, approximately 2.5 meters tall, with layered cranial plating the color of old bronze and a set of forward-oriented sensory organs that in younger Kavith glow a faint orange when they are paying close attention, and in older Kavith have faded to a dim amber that is almost always on. They were the first species in this sector to develop a functioning interstellar regulatory framework, and they are proud of this, as they should be. They are also very thorough. Our license was due for renewal. I had prepared for it for 4 months. This does not mean I spent 4 months being anxious about it. It means I spent 4 months making sure every document was current, every certification on the register had its supporting file, every procedural note that could conceivably be asked for was accessible within 30 seconds, and organized in a way that made it clear I knew why it existed. I had reviewed the Cavith Administrative Code's audit requirements in their current version, and identified 11 sections that applied to our operations and 4 that applied to corner cases we had never encountered but could conceivably encounter. And I had prepared notes on those 4 corner cases as well. I had reviewed the previous board's audit notes from 18 months prior and confirmed that every item they had flagged for follow-up had been addressed and the address documented. When I am preparing for something, I prepare completely. This is the other thing about me that is not remarkable, but that is mine. The review session was scheduled for the large conference room on sublevel 3, which has a long oval table with 12 seats, a holo display console at the far end, and floor-to-ceiling windows along the outer wall that look out over the docking bay where 7 of our 8 transit runners were currently berthed. The 8th was out on a fuel relay run and was due back by 1700. I had noted this in the pre-session filing. I had noted everything. I arrived 8 minutes early. Kestrel's nails made a soft clicking sound on the station's composite floor as we walked down the corridor, and she paused once at the water dispenser alcove to investigate a scent on the baseboard that I did not investigate. And then we went in. The board's preparation team was already inside, setting up the holo display console. There were 3 of them, young Cavith, in administrative service vests, moving with the efficient unhurriedness of people who have done this setup many times and know exactly how long it takes. One of them looked at Kestrel as we came in, then looked again. His sensory organs were orange. I said good morning in Cavith Standard, which I speak at a functional level, good enough for routine exchange, and for following a legal proceeding without a translation buffer if I concentrate. He said good morning back, still looking at Kestrel. She had already identified the chair I intended to sit in, and was arranging herself underneath it, chin going down onto the floor, eyes going to half-mast. She produced 2 slow, even tail wags in the general direction of the room and then went still. I sat down, opened my documentation case, and began laying out my files in order. The board itself arrived at 7 minutes past the hour, which was their prerogative. There were 4 of them, 3 senior examiners and 1 junior examiner, which is the standard configuration for a major license renewal. The senior examiners were old. The amber of their sensory organs was very deep, almost brown, which in Cavith terms suggests decades of professional experience, and the specific kind of patience that comes from having seen most arguments already. The junior examiner was young. Her organs glowed a clear orange. The lead senior examiner was named Delegate Huron Voss. He was the tallest of them, and wore an administrative sash over his vest that indicated a senior position within the board's permanent staff. I had reviewed his public record. He had conducted more than 300 license audits across the sector. He had a reputation for being meticulous, for asking the same question 3 different ways when he suspected the answer was being shaped, and for having an extensive knowledge of Cavith Administrative Code that he was not shy about deploying. He sat down across from me. The other senior examiners sat to his left. The junior examiner sat at the far end of the table, to my right, and opened her documentation tablet. Then he looked under my chair. He looked back at me. "Warrant Officer Suresh," he said in Cavith Standard, "you have brought an animal into the review session." "Yes," I said. "Her name is Kestrel. She's registered under Station Code 7, Handler Designation. I have the documentation here." I slid a copy across the table before he asked for it. He looked at the documentation without picking it up. He looked back under the chair. Kestrel had noticed the new people in the room and had turned her head slightly to look at them, which from her position involved moving only her eyes and a small adjustment of her chin on the floor. Her tail produced 2 slow, even wags, and then went still. "This is highly irregular," Delegate Huron Voss said. "I understand," I said. "If you'd like to confirm that the registration is in order before we proceed, I'm happy to wait." He picked up the documentation. He read it. He handed it to the senior examiner on his left, who read it and passed it to the one at the end. The junior examiner at the far right end of the table was watching Kestrel with her sensory organs at full orange. She had very slightly leaned forward. "The documentation appears to be in order," Delegate Huron-Voss said. He said it in the specific way that people say a thing is in order when they were hoping it would not be. "However, I would ask that the animal be removed for the duration of the session, as this board's procedural guidelines do not." "I've reviewed the board's procedural guidelines," I said. Section 14, subsection 3, paragraph 9. Registered working animals accompanying licensed handlers are permitted in closed administrative proceedings on the handler's discretion, provided the animal presents no active disruption to the session. Kestrel is registered, she's calm, and she'll stay under my chair. If she disrupts the session in any way, I'll remove her immediately. Silence. He looked at me. He looked under the chair again. Kestrel had closed her eyes most of the way. "She is lying on the floor," he said. "Yes," I said. "She is not performing a function." "She's accompanying her handler," I said. "That's her function." He settled back in his chair. The amber of his sensory organs had not changed, but there was something in the set of his cranial plating that I recognized from 19 years of meetings with people who have just been correctly cited at and would prefer not to have been. He smoothed the front of his administrative sash and opened his own documentation. "Very well," he said. "We will proceed." We proceeded. The first segment of a Cavith license audit covers what they call the Operational Integrity Index, a review of the license holder's safety record, incident reports, and compliance filings over the previous audit period. This is usually the easiest part. I had a clean record. No incidents over threshold, 4 minor equipment flags that had each been addressed and documented within the required response window, and a compliance filing completion rate of 100% over 19 months, which I am mentioning not to brag but because it is relevant to what happened later. Huron-Voss read through the safety record without comment. He asked me to confirm 3 dates on which equipment flags had been filed. I confirmed them. He asked about 1 flag involving a pressure seal on runner 6 that had required a replacement part to be sourced from a non-standard supplier. I explained the procurement process, the certification of the replacement component, and the subsequent reinspection. He listened. He asked 2 follow-up questions. I answered them. Under the table, Kestrel shifted slightly, tucked her nose under her front paw, and went to sleep. I could hear her breathing. The second segment covers personnel certification, the licensing status of every individual with operational authority over transit division equipment. This is where most audits find their material, because personnel records are living documents and people move around, get promoted, let certifications lapse, take leave without updating their files. I had spent 6 weeks before this audit going through every personnel file in my division and correcting every discrepancy I found, and I had found 11. I should explain what it means to find 11 discrepancies and then correct them. It does not mean that 11 people in my division had done something wrong. It means 11 records had drifted from perfect accuracy for various ordinary reasons. A certification renewed on a slightly different date than originally scheduled due to a training session shift. A secondary qualification logged in one system, but not propagated to the main register. An emergency leave period that had temporarily suspended a recertification process and been correctly restarted, but not formally noted as restarted in the primary file. None of these were problems anyone would have noticed during routine operations. All of them were problems that, in the event of a careful audit, would have appeared as discrepancies and required explanation. I found them. I corrected them. I documented each correction and filed a note explaining what had drifted, why, and what I had done about it. When you find your own discrepancies and correct them before someone else finds them, it demonstrates something different from having a clean record. It demonstrates that you look. Huron-Voss read through the personnel register. He slowed at the section covering our 2 senior corridor navigators, who hold dual certifications under both Transit Authority standards and Cavith Corridor Protocol, a relatively rare combination that requires its own documentation track. I note, he said, that Navigator Idris and Navigator Chen hold dual certifications. Correct. The Cavith Corridor Protocol certification for Navigator Chen shows a renewal date of the 8th of November. He looked up. The previous renewal was the 8th of November 3 years prior. Yes. The renewal interval for Cavith Corridor Protocol Level 3 is 30 months. It is, I said. Navigator Chen's certification is on a 30-month cycle. The gap between her last two renewals is 36 months, 6 months outside the standard cycle. I opened a tab in my documentation. In month 28 of that cycle, Navigator Chen applied for an extension under Cavith Administrative Code, Section 22, which allows a 6-month extension for license holders engaged in active corridor operations during a sector-wide remapping period. The remapping was authorized by the Cavith Navigation Directorate in that same month. The extension was granted. I have the authorization document here. I slid it across the table. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. This extension was granted by the Navigation Directorate, he said. Yes, not by this board. The board's authority over extensions in active remapping periods is superseded by Navigation Directorate authorization under Section 22, Paragraph 4. I can locate that for you if it would help. He did not tell me whether it would help. He read the authorization document again, then set it down. It appears to be in order, he said. Under my chair, Kestrel made a small sound, not a whimper, not a whine, just the brief, soft noise that sleeping dogs sometimes make when their ears register something without bringing them fully awake. One of the senior examiners looked under the table. His sensory organs went slightly more amber, which is as close as old Cavith get to a startle. The junior examiner at the end of the table was watching Kestrel with the focused attention of someone trying to classify something she had never encountered before and was not certain she had the vocabulary for. I had noticed her watching Kestrel for the better part of an hour. We moved into the third segment, which covers equipment certification. This is where audits tend to get long. Our equipment register runs to 41 line items: runners, maintenance rigs, cargo handling frames, specialized corridor instruments, and one decommissioned signal relay that I keep on the register because it is still technically on station, and removing it from the register without formally processing its decommission would create a discrepancy. Huron Voss had questions about the signal relay. I explained the decommission process and why it had not yet been formally closed. He asked why. I explained that the Cavith standard decommission form for signal relay equipment requires a counter-signature from a Navigation Directorate facility inspector, and the facility inspection for our station was scheduled. The station inspector had confirmed the date, and the form was waiting. He asked when. I gave him the date. He wrote it down. We went through the equipment register line by line. Huron Voss was thorough. He asked about every item that had a history note, and most of ours did because I write history notes. I write them because equipment has histories and the histories matter, and if you don't record them, someone will eventually make a decision without knowing something they should have known. He asked about Runner 2's navigation array, which had been recalibrated 18 months ago after a software anomaly in the corridor mapping integration. I explained the anomaly, the recalibration, the subsequent test runs, and the sign-off process. He asked about the cargo handling frame 9, which was on temporary restricted status pending a structural inspection. I explained the inspection schedule, why the frame had been restricted rather than simply used at lower loads, and what would trigger reinstatement. He asked about the spare parts inventory for Runner 4's atmospheric sealing system, which was maintained above the standard minimum because Runner 4 runs the station's most variable corridor segment, and I prefer having the parts on hand to waiting for a procurement cycle during a corridor weather event. He looked at me when I finished explaining that last one. You maintain above minimum inventory, he said, for a contingency that has not yet occurred. The corridor weather event occurred once, 4 years ago before I held this posting, I said. I reviewed the incident record. Runner 4's predecessor took a 14-day delay waiting for parts. The cargo on board had a 4-day tolerance window. He was quiet. The outcome? The tolerance was exceeded. The cargo was unusable. No lives lost, but the transit relationship with that delivery partner ended. I paused. I maintain above minimum inventory for Runner 4's atmospheric sealing parts because the corridor weather events are irregular, and the consequences of being wrong are concrete. The cost of maintaining the inventory is predictable and low. The cost of not maintaining it is unpredictable and potentially high. I reviewed the math and concluded the inventory was a sensible allocation. He looked at me for a moment. You reviewed an incident that occurred before your posting, he said. When I took this posting, I reviewed all incident records from the previous 12 years. Another silence. He made a note. Then he looked under the table. Kestrel was awake again. She had shifted so she was lying with her nose pointing toward Huron Voss, and she was watching him with the quiet, full-fronted attention she gives to things she finds interesting. Her tail made one slow wag. She held his gaze in the easy, undemanding way of an animal that is not asking for anything and not afraid of anything and simply observing. Huron Voss held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at his documentation and moved to the next item on the register. At the 2-hour mark, one of the senior examiners called for a 15-minute recess. I stood, stretched, and walked to the window. 7 runners in the bay. The 8th wasn't back yet, but we had time. I heard a sound behind me and turned. The junior examiner had left her seat at the far end of the table and was crouched beside my chair, looking at Kestrel. Not approaching, not reaching, just crouched and looking, at about the distance you'd look at something if you wanted to see it clearly, but weren't sure how it felt about being approached. Kestrel had opened her eyes. She looked at the junior examiner. The junior examiner looked at her. I came back to the table and stood nearby. She won't bite, I said in Kavith standard. You can say hello if you want. The junior examiner looked up at me. What is the protocol? She said carefully. For initiating contact, hold your hand out, back of the hand forward. Let her smell you first. Then you can pet her if she seems comfortable. The junior examiner extended her hand. It was a 3-fingered hand with broad, reinforced joints. Kavith hands are built for grip. For the same reason, their forearms are heavily muscled. Kestrel lifted her nose off the floor, extended it forward by perhaps 4 centimeters, and sniffed the back of the junior examiner's hand with the focused, data-gathering thoroughness that dogs bring to olfactory investigation. The junior examiner held very still. Kestrel's tail made 3 slow wags. She put her chin back down on her front paws. The junior examiner sat back slightly. Her sensory organs were orange. She assessed me, she said. She did, and found me. The junior examiner appeared to be searching for the word. Acceptable. She seems to think so. What was she assessing? I don't know exactly. Scent, mostly. She gets a great deal of information from scent that I don't have access to. Health status, stress levels, diet, emotional state. Dogs have around 300 million olfactory receptors. Humans have about 6 million. She knows things about you that I will never know. The junior examiner looked at Kestrel. What does she do with that information? She decides how to behave toward you, I said. She's decided you're fine. And if she had decided otherwise, I thought about how to answer that. She would have let me know, I said. The junior examiner looked at me, then at Kestrel. She was quiet for a moment. I read the pre-session filing, she said. You are rated as one of the 3 highest performing logistics compliance officers in this sector by the Transit Authority's internal review. I didn't know that, I said. I was mildly surprised. Internal rankings aren't typically shared with the people in them. We receive the internal review data as part of the pre-audit package, she said. Delegate Huron Voss reviewed it this morning. She paused. He reviewed it after he saw that you had logged the animal as accompanying documentation. I looked at her. She had a neutral expression that was, I thought, doing some work. I see, I said. The other examiners began returning to the table. The junior examiner stood up smoothly, went back to her seat, and opened her documentation tablet. She did not look at me again. Huron Voss settled back into his chair. He looked at the window, at the runners in the bay, then at me. "Warrant Officer Suresh," he said, "we will resume with the procedural compliance assessment." I sat down. Kestrel put her chin back on my foot. The procedural compliance assessment is the fourth and final segment of the audit, and is, in practice, the place where the board forms its actual judgment, because by that point they know the technical record, and what they are really assessing is whether the license holder understands why the procedures exist. It is a conversational segment. They ask open-ended questions about how decisions are made, how problems are handled, how edge cases are resolved. What they are listening for is whether the person in front of them is someone who follows rules because they are rules, or someone who follows rules because they understand the system the rules are designed to protect. I have always thought these are different things. I have met people who follow rules because they are rules, and I have met people who follow rules because they have read the revision history, and the two groups behave almost identically when nothing is going wrong. The difference only shows up in the gaps, in the situations the rules didn't quite anticipate, in the edge cases, and the novel failures, and the moments when you have to decide what the rule would have said if it had known about this particular situation. I am, I think, in the second group. I cannot prove this about myself, but 19 years of outcomes seems like moderate evidence. Huron Voss began with the fuel relay protocol. Our transit runners operate on a fuel relay system that requires coordination between the runner crew, the station logistics desk, and the fuel depot operator at the relay point. He asked me to walk him through a fuel relay run from the logistics desk's perspective. I walked him through it. The pre-departure fuel load verification, the departure check-in window, 15 minutes before scheduled launch, the corridor entry confirmation that triggers the relay point's advanced preparation, the mid-corridor check-in, mandatory at 4 hours for runs of our standard length, the relay point arrival confirmation, the fuel load transfer, the departure from relay confirmation, the return corridor entry, and the final docking notification. Each stage has a documentation event. Each documentation event has a response window. Each response window has a default action that triggers if the event is not confirmed within the window, because sometimes communication is disrupted and the system needs to be able to function without waiting to find out why. He listened. He asked what happens if the mid-corridor check-in is missed. "We begin the default action immediately," I said. "We don't wait to find out if it was equipment or something else. We log the missed event, open a status inquiry to the runner crew on the backup channel, and simultaneously notify the corridor coordinator that we have a potential disruption at that sector of the corridor. If the backup channel comes back clear within 20 minutes, we close the inquiry and note it as a communication anomaly. If it doesn't come back clear, we escalate, and if escalation is needed, we have a pre-filed escalation protocol with the corridor authority for each of our standard route segments. It was filed with the corridor documentation at the start of each route certification. The filing identifies the escalation contact at the corridor authority, the information that needs to be transmitted, and the threshold for requesting a response runner." I paused. I should note that in 19 years, we have never had to execute that protocol past the first stage. But the protocol is filed and current because the fact that we've never needed it past the first stage is not a reason to assume we never will. Huron Voss was quiet. His sensory organs had gone a shade lighter, not to orange, but slightly less deeply amber than they had been at the start of the session. I noticed this and said nothing about it. He asked about our incident reporting threshold. I explained the threshold, the rationale for where we had set it, and 2 cases in the past audit period where I had logged an incident at threshold rather than below it when a reasonable argument could have been made for the lower classification, and why I had chosen to log them at threshold. He asked why. Because the threshold sets by people who know more about aggregate risk than I do, I said. If I start making judgment calls about when to go below threshold, I'm substituting my local knowledge for the system's wider knowledge. I might be right in a specific case and still be wrong to do it, because the threshold isn't designed for a single station's judgment. It's designed to aggregate data across hundreds of stations, and if every station starts making individual adjustments, the aggregate stops being meaningful. I thought for a moment. The threshold is a collective instrument. Using it correctly means using it as designed, even when you think you have good local reasons to adjust it downward. He looked at me. You have just described, he said slowly, a reason to constrain your own discretion in favor of systemic integrity. Yes, I said. He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he asked about contingency documentation. Specifically, he asked whether I maintained written contingency plans for scenarios that were not required by the Transit Authority's standard protocol library. Scenarios I had identified myself as possible on the basis of my own assessment, rather than scenarios the protocol library had already anticipated. I said yes, I had 15 of them. He looked at me. 15. 15, I said. Would you like to see them? He said yes, I produced them. They were filed in a separate tab, clearly labeled, with a brief header on each one explaining what scenario it addressed, what in the station's operational history had prompted me to think about it, and what the plan prescribed. He went through them. He took longer on some than others. 2 of them he passed to the senior examiners. The senior examiners read them and made notes. One of the contingency plans covered the scenario in which a corridor weather event in our primary fuel relay corridor coincided with a delayed fuel load certification for one of the runners due at departure, leaving us in a switch where we had a runner ready to go and a corridor we couldn't see clearly, and a fuel certification that was running late because of an equipment issue in the certification bay. The plan prescribed a specific sequence of hold decisions, alternative corridor assessment checks, and communication steps, with decision points and criteria for each step. This scenario, Hirnvoss said, is not in the standard protocol library. No, I said. I developed it after I reviewed the incident records from the previous 12 years and identified 3 events that had each separately brought us close to a version of this scenario without actually arriving at it. I thought it was worth planning for. 3 separate events. 3. None of them were reported as near misses because none of them crossed the threshold individually. But the combination of factors they represented, corridor weather, delayed certification, and runner readiness pressure, appeared in all 3 at different intensities. I wrote the plan in year 2 of my posting. I've updated it twice since. He looked at the plan. He turned it over. He looked at the revision dates. Year 2, he said. Year 6, Year 8. Year 2 was the initial draft. Year 6, I updated it to reflect the new corridor weather monitoring system, which changed some of the assessment checkpoints. Year 8, I updated it when we changed our certification bay staffing model. He set it down. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I was not completely sure how to read, which was unusual because I can usually read people's expressions after 2 hours. Then he looked under the table. Kestrel was watching him with the calm, full frontal attention of a dog who has just noticed something and is taking it in. Her ears were slightly forward. Her tail was still. She held his gaze for a moment, the soft, unhurried gaze of an animal that is not afraid of being looked at because it has never needed to be. And then she put her chin back down on the floor and sighed, a long, slow exhale that moved through her whole chest and ended with her back muscles going visibly loose. Hirnvoss watched this happen. He was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about the decommissioned signal relay," he said. It was not a challenging question. His tone had changed by some amount I couldn't fully specify. Not warm, not unprofessional, just slightly different from the way he had been asking questions for the previous 2.5 hours. The amber of his sensory organs was the same, but there was something in how he held the question. I told him about the signal relay, the original installation date, the years of service, the decision to decommission it when we upgraded to the current relay system, the administrative steps I had taken, and the one remaining step that was waiting on the inspector. I told him that I had kept it on the active register rather than removing it, because removing it without completing the decommission would have created a gap in the equipment continuity record. And a gap in the equipment continuity record is the kind of thing that causes confusion later, possibly for someone who is trying to understand what happened and needs the record to be complete. You are describing, Herrenvoss said slowly, a record that is more difficult in the short term in order to be more useful at some unspecified point in the future. Yes, for the benefit of someone who may never need to consult it. Yes, who may not know that you made that choice. They won't know I made the choice, I said. They'll just find a complete record. That's the point. He looked at me. The sensory organs were the same amber they had been. But there was something in how he was sitting that was different from the beginning of the session. I have been reading rooms for 19 years. Something had shifted. Delegate Herrenvoss, the junior examiner said. He looked at her. She had been quiet for the last hour. I would like to note something for the record, she said. Proceed. Under Cavith Administrative Code Section 44, Subsection 7, the Companion Animal Classification Protocol, a working animal accompanying a licensed operator into a formal administrative proceeding is subject to classification review if any member of the board requests one. She did not look at me. She was looking at her documentation tablet. I am requesting one. One of the senior examiners on Herrenvoss's left shifted slightly. The protocol is typically invoked for species with uncertain behavioral risk profiles. I am aware, she said. I am invoking it. Herrenvoss looked at her for a moment. The animal is a domestic Earth Labrador, he said. It has been lying on the floor for 3 hours. I am aware, the junior examiner said again. I would still like the classification completed. There was a silence that had a texture to it. Very well, he said. Noted. He looked at me. Warrant Officer Suresh, we will require a brief additional segment to complete a companion animal classification for the animal in your care. This is standard under Section 44, Subsection 7. It will add approximately 40 minutes to the session. That's fine, I said. I have the time. Under the table, Kestrel's tail thumped twice against the floor. The Companion Animal Classification Protocol under Cavith Administrative Code is not something I had encountered before, but it is a thorough document. I know this because the junior examiner, whose name I learned when she introduced herself for the record, was Assessor Verith Soln, spent the first 10 minutes of the additional segment reading me its structure before beginning. The protocol exists to assess whether an animal accompanying a registered handler in Cavith administrative space meets the criteria for a formal status designation, which can range from auxiliary domestic, non-threat, no operational status, through several intermediate categories, up to what the protocol calls a recognized apex companion, which is a designation that carries specific rights and responsibility for both the animal and the handler. I had never heard of a recognized apex companion designation before. Solon was methodical. She worked through the classification checklist in order, asking me questions and recording my answers. What was Kestrel's species and subspecies? Her age? Her documented health status? Her behavioral training history? Her exposure to non-Earth environments and species? Her response record to high-stress scenarios? Had she been present in any situations involving threat, conflict, or operational emergency? And if so, what had her behavioral response been? I answered each question fully. For the behavioral response question, I gave her 4 examples. The first was 3 years ago, when a coolant line ruptured in the maintenance bay adjacent to my office, and the emergency response team came through, at some speed and volume. Kestrel had stood up, assessed the situation, moved to stand between the noise and me, determined that I was not in danger, and sat back down. She did not bark. The second was 2 years ago, When a contractor who had not been cleared for the logistics section came through, the door with a set of scanning equipment and a manner that Kestrel did not like. She had stood up, walked to stand between him and me, and looked at him until he introduced himself to my satisfaction. She did not bark. The third was 18 months ago, when a heated dispute between two of my personnel escalated to shouting in the outer office. Kestrel had walked to the doorway, looked at the two of them, and sat down. They had both stopped shouting within approximately 30 seconds. She had then returned to her spot and lay down. The fourth was 6 months ago, when a delegation from another transit authority had been in the conference room, and one of the visiting officers, under the mistaken impression that the meeting had concluded, had raised his voice to one of my junior staff in a way that I would have addressed but did not have time to, because by the time I was out of my chair, Kestrel was already in the doorway, simply looking at him, and the conversation had recalibrated itself. I had written up incident reports for the second and fourth examples. I provided copies. Soln read them. She was quiet for a moment. In each of these cases, she said, the animal interposed herself between a perceived threat and her handler. Yes, without a command, without a command. And in the case of the dispute between a threat and a third party, a junior staff member who is not her handler, yes, she extended her protective assessment to include the staff member. She extended it to include everyone in my division, I said. She considers them all hers. She's been with them for 5 years. Soln made a note. Has she ever made contact with a threatening party? She's never needed to, I said. Soln looked at me. Her sensory organs were fully orange. Has she ever communicated the capability? I thought about that for a moment. The contractor who came through the wrong door, I said. When he looked at her, he stepped backward. He didn't say why. He signed in at the front desk and came back through the right way. Soln noted that. She asked about Kestrel's physical specifications. Weight, height at the shoulder, bite force. She had pulled a reference sheet on Labrador retrievers and was reading from it. Bite force of approximately 150 pounds per square inch, she noted. Sustained tracking capability in excess of 12 hours. Swimming endurance of several kilometers. Olfactory capability 300 times human baseline, allowing detection of chemical compounds at parts per trillion concentrations. We have a reference document in our taxonomy system, she said carefully, for the Labrador retriever. It was filed under Auxiliary Domestic, Category 3, Non-Threat, Companionship and Light Service Function. I said. I am revising this assessment, she said. Huron Voss, who had been listening to this for 35 minutes with an expression I could not read, said, Assessor Soln, on what grounds? The classification criteria for Auxiliary Domestic, Category 3 requires a behavioral profile consistent with non-predatory origin, limited territorial response, and absence of directed protective behavior. She looked up. This animal has a documented protective behavioral record. She has demonstrated threat assessment capability. She has demonstrated extension of protective scope to non-Heldler individuals. She paused. The origin species, Canis lupus familiaris, diverged from a predatory predecessor approximately 15,000 years ago, which is recent by taxonomic standards. The underlying behavioral substrate is predatory. The domestication layer modulates expression. It does not remove capability. One of the senior examiners was now looking at Kestrel. Kestrel was looking at the senior examiner. Her tail was making slow, even wags. She is wagging her tail, the senior examiner said. Yes, Soln said. That is an affiliative social signal indicating comfort and non-hostility. It is also consistent with high confidence. An animal that wags its tail in the presence of potential threat does so because it does not assess the potential threat as a genuine threat. She looked at the senior examiner. You are not a threat to her. The senior examiner looked at Soln, then back at Kestrel. Kestrel yawned. It was a full jaw-stretching, tongue-curling yawn that showed every one of her teeth and lasted approximately 2 seconds. And then she rested her chin back on the floor and closed her eyes. The room was quiet. Nobody said anything for a moment. The yawn was the kind of thing that reshapes a silence. The senior examiner was looking at the floor where Kestrel had her chin. The other senior examiner had stopped writing. Huron Voss had his hands folded on the table. "She is relaxed," one of the senior examiners said. It was not a question. "She is relaxed," I said. "In the presence of," he gestured slightly at himself, at the other examiners, at the room. "She's been relaxed since we walked in," I said. "She evaluated the room and found nothing to be concerned about. She's been sleeping on and off for 3 hours. The senior examiner looked at me. He looked at Kestrel. He appeared to be working through something. "An apex predator," he said slowly, "that has found nothing to be concerned about. A working line Labrador retriever from a domestic breeding program," I said. "Who has found nothing to be concerned about?" He sat back. Huron Voss unfolded his hands and looked at Soln. "What classification are you recommending?" he said. "Recognized Apex Companion Class 2, she said, with operational notation. There was another silence. "The last recognized Apex Companion designation in this sector," one of the senior examiners said, "was awarded to a Karath warhound belonging to Admiral Davin Sorel 15 years ago." "I'm aware," Soln said. "The classification criteria don't specify species of origin. They specify behavioral and capability profile." Huron Voss looked at Kestrel for a long moment. Kestrel breathed slowly, in-out. Her back rose and fell. "It would require a formal reclassification filing," he said. "Yes," Soln said, "it would. The reclassification closes the session." He looked at me. I looked back at him. "The operating license," he said, "was never in question. The record is complete. The compliance is 100%. He said this without any particular expression, which told me it had been true since approximately the first hour of the session, and he was only saying it now because the session required a formal summary. "Thank you," I said. "The reclassification will add 11 minutes to the session close," he said. "I will complete it now." He turned to his documentation console and began entering the filing. The 11 minutes passed quietly. Soln was making notes on her tablet. One of the senior examiners had turned slightly in his chair and was watching Kestrel in a way that had nothing professional about it. Just watching a dog sleep, the way people watch dogs sleep when they are not in a hurry to be anywhere else. At the 6-minute mark, Kestrel shifted. She rolled slightly onto her side, stretched her front legs forward to their full extension in the deep, total commitment stretch that dogs do when they are very comfortable and not at all concerned about who is watching. Her back legs followed. She held the stretch for a moment, exhaled completely, and then went still again, lying on her side with her legs extended and her chest rising and falling slowly. Nobody said anything. The senior examiner watching her made a small sound, very quiet, that I recognized because I have made versions of it myself. It is the sound of something that cannot quite be put into words, but doesn't need to be. At 9 minutes, Huron Voss looked up from his console. "Assessor Soln," he said, "your dissent on the original taxonomy classification will be filed with the board's procedural record." "Thank you," she said. "It will also be forwarded to the Cavith Biological Assessment Division for standing taxonomy review." He paused. "The Labrador Retriever category file will be flagged for revision." Soln made a note. At 11 minutes, Huron Voss completed the filing. "Warrant Officer Suresh," he said. "Station Orvith 2, Transit Authority Logistics Division operating license is renewed for the standard term. The renewal documentation will be transmitted to your office by the end of the business day." He looked at Kestrel. "Your companion animal has been reclassified under Cavith Administrative Code as Recognized Apex Companion, Class 2. Handler Designation Warrant Officer Priya Suresh, Transit Authority Logistics Division, Station Orvith 2. Her Transit Authority Identification Tag should be updated to reflect the designation. We will transmit the updated registry entry to the station administrator." "I'll get a new tag made," I said. He nodded. He closed his documentation console. The two senior examiners began packing their materials. Soln stood, gathered her tablet, and came around the table. She stopped at a careful distance from Kestrel, who had opened her eyes at the sound of the chairs moving. and was now lying on her side, watching the room clear out with the relaxed, observational patience she brings to all similar transitions. "May I?" Soln said. "Go ahead," I said. She crouched down and held out the back of her hand. Kestrel stretched her nose forward, sampled the air in Soln's direction. 4 inches away, not quite contact, then withdrew her nose, made 3 slow tail wags, and closed her eyes again. Soln looked at her for a moment. "She is very calm," she said. "She's always calm," I said. "Why?" I thought about that. It was a genuine question and deserved a genuine answer. "I think," I said slowly, "she knows what she is. She doesn't need to demonstrate it. She's not trying to convince anyone of anything. She just—" I looked at Kestrel. "She's just present. Whatever the room does, she already knows how she'd handle it if she had to. And she's never had to, so she's calm." I paused. "She's been calm her whole life. In 19 years, I haven't been in a situation I couldn't handle. I think she may have had something to do with that, but I can't prove it." Soln looked at Kestrel for another moment. "I will note," she said, carefully, "that the taxonomy revision for the Labrador Retriever category is likely to take several months. The board does not move quickly on classification revisions. I understand." "There are," she said, still looking at Kestrel, "approximately 412 registered Labrador Retrievers in Cavith administrative space, currently classified as auxiliary domestic, Category 3. I looked at her. She looked at me. Her sensory organs were very orange. "Well," I said, "that will be something." She straightened up. She gave Kestrel one more look, a look that had the quality of someone filing a reference image for a document they were going to be working on for a long time. Then she nodded to me, gathered her tablet, and went out. Huron Voss was last. He paused at the door and looked back at Kestrel. She had rolled back onto her chest, chin on the floor, eyes half open, tail making a slow wag in his direction. He looked at her for a moment. 19 years, he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said. He looked at the documentation spread on the table, the files I had brought, the documents I had produced, the clean and complete record of 19 years of work done correctly, on time, with the forms filled out in full. He looked at Kestrel. He made a small sound that I could not translate, but that had, I thought, something philosophical in it. And then he went out, and the door slid shut behind him. I sat in the empty conference room and looked out the window. The 8th runner was coming in, right on schedule. I watched it slow and settle into the docking approach. The nav lights blinking in the standard sequence. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. I thought about the 15 contingency plans in my documentation file. I thought about the 11 discrepancies I had found and corrected before the audit. I thought about the signal relay on the active register, waiting for its inspector, its decommission form sitting in a folder ready to be completed the moment the countersignature became available. I thought about the 30 years of work Copper had done in the back garden of my childhood home, keeping track of 8 children across 5 yards, never asked to, never thanked for it. He had been calm his whole life too. I looked down. Kestrel had her chin on my foot. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was slow and even and completely unbothered, the way it always is, the way it has been for 5 years. The way it will be tomorrow when we go back to the office and she finds her spot under the desk and I find my chair and we do the work again. I scratched her ears. Her tail thumped once against the floor. The transmission from Huron Voss's office arrived at 1743 that afternoon. The operating license renewed for the standard term, and the updated registry entry for Kestrel, recognized Apex Companion, Class 2, with a note appended from the board's administrative staff, indicating that the tag update should include the new designation code and that any future administrative proceedings in Cavith jurisdiction would need to formally note her presence in the session record. I read the note twice. Then I read it a 3rd time, because that was how many times it took before I was sure I had not missed anything. I set it down on the desk. I looked at Kestrel. She was looking at me with her chin on her front paws, tail doing a slow, even wag, with the expression she has when she is waiting for something ordinary to happen, like a walk or her dinner or for me to get my coat and take us both home. Well, I said, she wagged. I got my coat.